They warned you marriage would complete you. They lied. You're 40 now, sitting in a house that feels like a prison, looking at a woman who's become a stranger, and the worst part isn't what you've lost. It's realizing you walked into this cage willingly. Arthur Schopenhauer, one of history's most brutally honest philosophers, spent his life watching men make this mistake. And what he discovered will make you question everything you thought you knew about marriage, love, and what it really means to be free. Here's something nobody tells you until it's too late. That feeling you have right now, that quiet desperation, that sense that you've been tricked, Schopenhauer predicted it over 150 years ago. He called marriage the ultimate trap, not because it's inherently evil, but because it's built on a biological deception so clever, so perfectly disguised as love, that by the time you realize what happened, you're already locked in. And the really terrifying part is this: you chose it, you wanted it, you convinced yourself it was your idea. But was it really? Think about the last time you felt truly free. Not weekend free, not vacation free, but genuinely free to do whatever you wanted without considering someone else's feelings, schedules, expectations, or needs. Can't remember? That's not an accident. That's the design. Schopenhauer understood something that modern society desperately tries to hide from you. Marriage isn't about your happiness. It's about control. It's about turning a wild, unpredictable man into a domesticated, predictable worker. And the genius of it is that they make you think it was your choice all along. The philosopher saw through the romantic illusions that society wraps around marriage like pretty packaging on a box full of obligations. He watched men fall for the same trap generation after generation, blinded by what he called the will to life, a biological drive so powerful that it overrides your rational mind, hijacks your decision-making, and convinces you that this one person will finally make you complete. But here's the dark truth he discovered. That feeling isn't love. It's nature manipulating you into reproduction. And once you've served that biological purpose, the illusion fades, and you're left staring at reality. A legal contract that binds you to another person's chaos, expectations, and demands for the rest of your life, or until you're willing to lose half of everything you've built. The 7 lessons you're about to learn aren't just observations. They're warnings from a man who spent his entire life studying human nature, desire, suffering, and the games society plays with your happiness. These aren't comfortable truths. They won't make you feel good, but they will make you see clearly. And in a world built on romantic illusions and social programming, clarity is the most dangerous thing you can possess. Because once you see the cage, you can't unsee it. Once you understand the game, you can't pretend you don't know the rules. Once you learn these lessons, everything about marriage, relationships, and what you've been told about being a man will look different. Let's start with the darkest lesson of all, the one that explains why you felt so certain about getting married, and why that certainty turned out to be your biggest mistake. Schopenhauer called it the will to life, and it's the puppet master behind every romantic decision you thought was yours. You remember that feeling, don't you? When you first met her, the obsession, the certainty that she was different, special, the one. You couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything else. Society called it falling in love. Poets wrote songs about it. Everyone told you this was the most beautiful thing that could happen to you. But Schopenhauer saw something else entirely. He saw biology hijacking your brain. The will to life isn't some mystical force. It's nature's way of ensuring reproduction. It floods your system with chemicals, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, that create an altered state of consciousness. You weren't thinking clearly. You were literally intoxicated. And in that intoxicated state, you made permanent decisions. Marriage, kids, mortgages, merged lives. You signed contracts and made vows while under the influence of a biological drive that had nothing to do with your long-term happiness and everything to do with continuing the species. Here's what makes this so insidious. The high doesn't last. Schopenhauer knew that passionate love has a shelf life. Studies now confirm what he intuited. That intense romantic feeling typically lasts between 18 months and 3 years. Just long enough to get you married, probably pregnant, and legally bound. Then the chemicals fade, the fog lifts, and you're standing there looking at an actual human being with flaws, annoying habits, different life goals, and incompatible communication styles. And you think, wait, who is this person? But it's too late, you're already trapped. This is the first dark lesson. The feeling that convinced you to get married wasn't love. It was biology. And biology doesn't care about your happiness. It cares about reproduction. Your individual happiness is irrelevant to the biological imperative. And marriage is the social structure designed to keep you locked in place long after the chemicals fade, long after the attraction dies, long after you realize you've made a mistake. Society knows this. Everyone knows this. Your parents knew it. Your married friends knew it. But nobody warned you. Why? Because if young men understood that marriage is often a trap disguised as destiny, the entire social structure would collapse. The passion was designed to fade. It was only there to trap you. The second dark lesson builds on the first, and it's even more brutal. You thought marriage would be a partnership. You imagined two people building a life together, supporting each other, growing together. What you got instead was a never-ending performance where you're always auditioning for approval, always proving your worth, always trying to be enough. And the worst part is you can never actually succeed because the standards keep changing and the goalpost keeps moving. Schopenhauer observed something that most men don't realize until they're deep into marriage. Women, driven by their own biological and social programming, often enter marriage with unconscious expectations that are impossible to fulfill. They've been told that a man should make them happy, provide security, offer emotional support, maintain attraction, be a perfect father, a successful professional, and somehow remain the passionate lover from the beginning. These expectations create an impossible standard that turns marriage into a performance where you're constantly being evaluated and constantly falling short. Watch what happens in a typical marriage. In the beginning, you were enough just by existing. But slowly, subtly, the message changes. You need to be more romantic. You need to help more around the house. You need to be more emotionally available. You need to earn more money. You need to be more present with the kids. You need to maintain your appearance. You need to read her mind about what she needs. You need to somehow be everything at once. And when you inevitably fail at one or more of these impossible standards, you're met with disappointment, criticism, or withdrawal of affection. Marriage creates a dynamic where men become performers and women become judges. Schopenhauer saw that marriage transforms authentic human beings into role players. You stop being yourself and start being a husband, which means constantly trying to fulfill someone else's expectations of what a husband should be. The exhaustion you feel isn't because you're weak. It's because you're trying to maintain a performance that requires you to abandon your authentic self. You can't pursue your actual interests because they're selfish. You can't take risks because you have responsibilities. You can't express your real thoughts because they might upset her. You can't prioritize your own needs because that makes you a bad husband. So you perform. You smile when you're angry. You agree when you disagree. You pretend to care about things that bore you. You sacrifice your authentic desires for the appearance of being a good partner. And here's the cruelest part. Even when you do everything right, even when you perform perfectly, it's never enough. Because the underlying promise of marriage that this person will make you complete and happy is impossible to fulfill. No human being can make another human being perpetually happy. But marriage sells that fantasy. So when happiness inevitably fluctuates, whose fault is it? Yours. You're not doing enough. You're not being enough. The third dark lesson cuts even deeper. Your identity doesn't expand when you get married. It dies. Schopenhauer observed that marriage demands the sacrifice of your individual self on the altar of collective identity. You're no longer a man with dreams, desires, and a unique path. You become half of a unit, and that unit has priorities that always supersede your individual needs. Think about who you were before marriage. You had interests that were yours alone. You had friends who knew you as an individual. You had time to explore ideas, take risks, pursue passions. Now ask yourself honestly, how much of that person still exists? How many of those interests have you abandoned? How many of those friends have you lost? How much of your internal life have you sacrificed because sharing it honestly would threaten the stability of the relationship? Marriage doesn't just ask you to compromise. It demands that you dissolve. The individual you becomes the collective we. Schopenhauer called this the negation of the will. You stop willing your own life and start willing the life that marriage requires. Your energy, creativity, time, and resources all get redirected from individual flourishing to maintaining the relationship. The tragedy is that society celebrates this death as maturity. They tell you that giving up your individual identity is what grown men do. That sacrifice is noble. But Schopenhauer saw through this moral manipulation. He understood that a man who has lost his individual identity hasn't become mature. He's become empty. Watch what happens when married men get together without their wives. They talk about their marriages like prisoners talk about their sentences. They joke about losing themselves, about having no freedom. But underneath the jokes is real grief. Grief for the person they used to be. Grief for the life they might have lived. And this grief can't be spoken directly, because that would be admitting that marriage actually diminished them. The fourth dark lesson is about economics, but not the way you think. Schopenhauer understood that marriage is fundamentally a transaction disguised as romance. You provide resources, time, energy, money, emotional labor, and security. She provides something in return: companionship, sex, domestic management, and social legitimacy. But here's what makes this transaction so brutal. The terms constantly change and you have no power to renegotiate. When you got married, there was an implicit contract. You would be the provider, the protector, the stable force. She would be the companion, the lover, the person who made the home feel like home. But what happens when one side stops delivering? What happens when sex becomes infrequent or obligatory? What happens when companionship turns into coexistence? What happens when the home feels more like a battlefield than a sanctuary? In any other transaction, you could walk away. But marriage doesn't work that way. You're locked in. The resources keep flowing out. The obligations keep mounting. But the return on investment diminishes or disappears entirely. And if you complain, if you dare to mention that you're not getting what you thought you were signing up for, you're the bad guy. You're shallow, selfish, treating the relationship like a business. But the truth Schopenhauer saw is that it always was a transaction. Society just shames you for acknowledging it. Most men are net providers in marriage. The resources flow primarily in one direction. Your income becomes our income. Your time becomes family time. Your energy becomes household energy. And this might feel fine when the marriage is good. But when it's not, when you're unhappy, unfulfilled, trapped, you're still required to provide those resources. The investment continues, but the dividends have stopped. And divorce doesn't free you from this economic trap. It makes it worse. Now you're providing resources for a household you don't even live in. You're paying for the life of someone who's no longer your partner. You're funding the very cage you're trying to escape. Schopenhauer observed that marriage creates a specific kind of economic bondage where men become permanently obligated, regardless of what they receive in return. Society has structured it so that the moment you say those vows, your resources become permanently attached to another person. Whether the relationship works or not, whether you're happy or miserable, whether it was the right choice or a terrible mistake. This economic reality explains why so many men stay in dead marriages. The cost of leaving, financially, socially, emotionally, is often higher than the cost of staying. Schopenhauer would tell you this isn't love. This is economic hostage-taking disguised as commitment. The fifth dark lesson is perhaps the most painful because it's about hope. You keep thinking things will get better. You keep believing that if you just work harder at the relationship, communicate better, be more understanding, the marriage will return to something good. But Schopenhauer understood something brutal about human nature and relationships. They don't get better, they reveal themselves. The problems you're having now aren't temporary obstacles to overcome. They're the actual nature of the relationship finally becoming visible. In the beginning, both people are performing their best selves. You're showing your most attractive qualities, hiding your flaws, making efforts you can't sustain forever. She's doing the same. But over time, performance gives way to reality. The real people emerge. The real incompatibilities surface. Most men interpret this as the relationship deteriorating. But Schopenhauer would say, it's not deteriorating. It's simply becoming honest. The version of the marriage you had in the beginning wasn't real. It was two people performing for each other. Now you're seeing what the marriage actually is. And if what it actually is doesn't satisfy you, no amount of effort will change that fundamental truth. You can't negotiate someone into being different than they are. You can't communicate your way out of core incompatibility. This is why marriage counseling so rarely works. You're trying to fix something that isn't broken. The marriage is working exactly as it was always going to work given who you both actually are. You just didn't know who you both actually were when you got married, because you were blinded by biology and performing for each other. Schopenhauer saw that humans torture themselves with hope. We keep believing that the future will be different than the present, that change is possible, that effort will be rewarded. But in most marriages, the future is just more of the present. The patterns you're living now will be the patterns you live for the next 20, 30, 40 years. The only question is whether you can accept that reality, or whether you'll waste decades hoping for a transformation that will never come. This lesson is dark because it removes hope. And humans can endure almost anything except the truth that their suffering is permanent, and that the choice they made cannot be unmade without catastrophic consequences. The sixth dark lesson is about sex, but not in the way you might think. Schopenhauer understood that sexual desire creates a specific kind of prison in marriage. In the beginning, sex is abundant and passionate. This abundance creates the illusion that your needs will always be met, so you agree to sexual exclusivity. You promise to forsake all others. You lock yourself into a situation where one person becomes your only legitimate sexual outlet. But then something inevitable happens. Desire fades, frequency drops, passion dies, and suddenly you find yourself in a situation where you're not having the sex you need, but you're also not allowed to get it anywhere else. You're trapped in sexual scarcity but bound by vows to pretend you're satisfied. This creates a specific kind of suffering that society refuses to acknowledge. You're a healthy man with normal desires living in a state of perpetual sexual frustration. But you can't talk about it because that makes you shallow. You can't address it directly because that creates pressure. You can't seek satisfaction elsewhere because that makes you a cheater. So you suffer in silence while your sexual energy has nowhere to go. It turns inward and becomes resentment, frustration, depression, or quiet desperation. And the cruelest part is that your wife isn't necessarily doing anything wrong. Her desire has simply faded the way Schopenhauer predicted it would once the biological imperative was served. But the structure of marriage doesn't account for this inevitability. It assumes that mutual desire will remain constant. And when it doesn't, you're trapped in a commitment you made based on circumstances that no longer exist. Schopenhauer would call this voluntary castration disguised as commitment. You've agreed to cut off a fundamental part of your nature in exchange for social legitimacy and the fantasy of permanence. The seventh and final dark lesson is the one Schopenhauer considered most important. Suffering is not a bug in marriage, it's a feature. You keep thinking that if you can just solve this problem or get through this phase, you'll finally be happy. But Schopenhauer's entire philosophy was built on understanding that suffering is the fundamental nature of human existence. And marriage doesn't exempt you from this, it concentrates it. When you're single, your suffering is diffuse. Work stress, loneliness, uncertainty about the future. But that suffering exists in a context of freedom. You can change jobs, move cities, pursue new interests, reinvent yourself. The suffering is real, but it's not totalizing because you maintain agency. But in marriage, suffering becomes inescapable. You've bound yourself to another person whose problems become your problems, whose moods affect your peace, whose needs limit your choices. Schopenhauer observed that humans create their own prisons and then complain about being trapped. Marriage is the perfect example. You voluntarily entered into a legal, social, and emotional binding that severely restricts your freedom, and now you're suffering because of those restrictions. But instead of seeing that the structure itself creates suffering, you think something is wrong with your specific marriage or your specific partner. This blindness keeps you trapped because you keep trying to fix the wrong problem. You think you need better communication, more date nights, or deeper understanding. But the actual problem is that you've confined yourself in a way that makes sustained happiness nearly impossible. Two people with different needs, desires, backgrounds, and paths trying to merge into one unified life will inevitably create friction, compromise, resentment, and loss. That's not a failure. That's the nature of the arrangement. The suffering in your marriage isn't an accident or a sign that you married the wrong person. It's the inevitable result of trying to force two independent beings into permanent unity. Schopenhauer would tell you that the question isn't how to make your marriage happy. It's whether you're willing to accept the suffering that marriage necessarily creates. Some men decide that the benefits outweigh the suffering. Others realize they've paid too high a price. But both groups need to see clearly that the suffering isn't temporary and it isn't fixable. It's the permanent cost of the choice they made. And this realization, brutal as it is actually liberating. Because once you stop hoping for the marriage to become something it can never be, once you accept the suffering as inherent rather than solvable, you can make a clear-eyed decision about what you actually want to do with the rest of your life. These 7 dark lessons aren't meant to make you bitter. They're meant to make you see clearly. Schopenhauer believed that wisdom comes from seeing reality without illusions. And reality is that marriage, for many men, delivers far less than it promises and costs far more than they imagined. The romantic love that got you here was biological manipulation. The partnership you expected became endless performance. Your individual identity died. The economic transaction became one-sided bondage. The hope for improvement was delusion. Sexual exclusivity became a prison, and the suffering wasn't a problem to solve but the nature of what you chose. Now you understand what they didn't tell you before you said those vows. Drop a comment right now telling me which of these 7 lessons hit you hardest. Write exactly this. Lesson number changed everything for me. This isn't just a comment, this is you acknowledging the truth you've been avoiding. And when you see how many other men write the same thing, you'll realize you're not alone in this recognition. You're part of a growing number of men who refuse to live in denial anymore. That connection, that knowing other men see what you see, that matters more than you realize right now. Subscribe to this channel because what we're building here is different. This isn't feel-good content that tells you what you want to hear. This is the truth about manhood, relationships, freedom, and the games society plays with your life. Every video gives you clarity that most men never find. Hit that like button because it tells me you're ready for more uncomfortable truths. The algorithm shows this content to other men who need to hear it, but only if you engage. Your like literally changes another man's life by getting this message in front of him before he makes the same mistakes you did. Something is coming in the next video that will challenge everything you thought you understood about power, control, and who actually runs your life. The philosophers saw patterns that most people miss completely. Patterns that explain why you feel the way you do, why certain people have power over you, and how to break free from invisible chains you didn't even know were there. This next topic will make today's lesson look gentle. Make sure you're subscribed, because missing this next video means staying blind to the deepest layer of control in your life. And now that you've seen this far, staying blind isn't an option anymore.